Hi, welcome to Comes and Culture for I'll get this up before 8. October 4th, 2018. Yeah, I'll be doing a autopsy on the 2018 Cubs. I'm 95% happy with the season. I wish it didn't peter out the way it did, but whatever. You can try again next year. So there's that. Anyway, so we're up to How Green Was My Valley, which is the Best Picture from 1941. Going through the Best Pictures, this is probably one of the most infamous ones because it won Picture and Director over Citizen Kane, which for a long, long time, like over 50 years, it was considered the best film ever made. It's now Vertigo, which I think has a little bit more to do with the time we live in, as opposed to all the other films. Anyway, this is the first Best Picture winner where I really don't like it. I'll talk a little bit more detail when I bring up the trailer and everything. But basically, the problem is, it's okay. So, How Green Was My Valley is a coming of age story connected to, and it actually reminds me of this book, and the book is far better, called Neon Bible by John Kennedy Toole. Neon Bible was his other book, his Confederacy of Dunces, that author, aka the best book ever written. Anyway, so it's basically a coming of age story, sort of, which is framed around this Welsh mining family, and it's basically the protagonist Hugh's 10 or so, maybe not 10, just the things you remember the most, and it's framed around his memory, and it's a frame story, so there's constant voiceover narration. I am glad to see he did not win screenplay, because that would have been horrible, because the screenplay is the worst part of this movie by far. And so there's not really, the movie is dramatically inert, and because it's framed basically as memories, it's very, very, very episodic, and there's just no dramatic tension that goes throughout the entire story. And so it's sort of framed as a story about unionization and politics of conservative tradition versus the next generation around politics, but it doesn't really coalesce into human themes. Partially because Zanuck, who is the producer, did not want it to do that because of it being him being a Republican and him himself being against unions. So like the union stuff, so like the labor themes aren't really all that well developed. And then there's also like cultural, societal norms around in the church, which again doesn't really coalesce. So this movie is very, very gorgeous to look at, and directorially, I actually think it's badly directed. But in terms of like the formal elements of direction, it's very, very well composed, and Ford had a very good eye. But in terms of its story and everything, it's just very, very dramatically inert and very, very slow. And it's a very, very shallow film. So let me bring up the trailer and a couple of clips. Okay, so because the movie is so dramatically inert, it largely because there's no real clear source of antagonism in this film. You would think it's partially the mining and the economic pressures about being a mining family in Wales and Wales at this time, and then it's also partially just traditionalist because there's generational conflict, but it's not really all that well developed, and everything just seems to resolve too quickly. So like The father, Mr. Morgan, is anti-union. His sons are pro-union, and then they have a big fight, and then they move out, and then that's it. They just sort of get dropped out, or as I'll show you in a moment, Hugh gets injured because of the machinations of the plot. He ends up in cold water, and so he ends up having to be bedridden for a couple of months, but then he just sort of grows out of it. And I guess that, again, that makes sense as a sort of a coming of age story thing, but it's just so flat. And partially, I think it's in the direction as well, not just the writing. With how non-dramatic it is, it called for a far less prettified, more gritty style of direction. And there's this, I don't know if it's the Welsh accents, I don't know if because Ford encourages actors to act like this, everything like that. It just sort of has a weird, everyone has sort of a weird cadence to their speech where everything seems heavy and ponderous, and it reminds me of all things with William Shatner. So everyone kind of talks like this, and it's just not all that. So the movie, the tone of the movie, is sort of very oppressive, and because it's not earning it, the writing doesn't earn the directorial gravity. And so anyways, this scene is a good example of what I mean, how the movie just sort of have episodes that bring up attention and then doesn't develop it and sort of resolves immediately. So that's Hugh, he's being bedridden, and then the preacher character is sort of one of the main characters. And they're going to go up here, and he was going to learn to walk again, but this is his first time, and the guy just sort of drops him on the ground and walks away and says, "Come, you can walk," and he just sort of walks. And there's swelled with music and everything like that, and it doesn't feel all that realistic in general because of the injury, but also it doesn't feel dramatically correct because it's too soon, it's too easy. It's just there's no like build up, reversal, resolution. It's in this episode, and so it just doesn't. So it just feels like doesn't feel like a story. It feels like a series of events. And this is a good place to talk a little bit about the direction. Visually, it's like he's sort of framed by the trees and everything, and the shadows and everything are very picturesque and statuesque, which is sort of, excuse me, very visually pleasing. But because of the nature of the story, it being sort of an everyday, that's what I mean by the framing. The trees sort of framing the backlit. It's very, very pretty, and so because of the framing, because the story just doesn't earn the gravity of the visuals. And probably the best example of this is this scene. So Hugh's the main character. He's the kid that's growing up. His sister marries the mine owner's son, and there's an implication she did to help the family, but it doesn't make any sense to me why she would go into this loveless marriage. Because the family is sort of struggling, but everything like that, struggling, but it's not made clear that their situation is dire. And she's in love with the preacher, and the preacher turns her down because he doesn't want her living in poverty, which is fine, and that explains why they can't be together. It does not explain why she then has to enter into this loveless marriage, and you don't spend a lot of time with this woman at all. And it's not like in Cavalcade, where this is like a meditation on the meaning of time. It's not referenced to any like nostalgia. It's just a series of events of this character's memory, not our collective memory. And so this thing is about statuesque and pondering and being just not earning not earning its sort of gravity. Is that her veil? That's not an accident. They actually had like multiple fans to make sure it blew exactly like this. And it's supposed to be this really tragic thing, and I'm just like, I don't understand why you felt the need to marry him, because this idea is not developed. And so even like that's the preacher in the background, and him looking sad is sort of a really good um, visually thing. It just doesn't earn it. Or then you also have stuff like this, and this is to me the biggest offender in the movie, because Hugh's father, this is his last memory, and Hugh's father dies in a mining accident, which is fine, but except mining accidents were never, or safety was never really concerned in the movie. And the movie in general is not realistic enough to say, well, it's about the randomness of life, because it's not. It just doesn't feel that way, even though that might be one that they were going for. But this shot right here is what really bothers me. There's no reason for the preacher to be standing like that, other than the visual framing of Hugh and his father, which again is a striking image, but it doesn't work because it doesn't feel believable. And so this film's tone is really sort of bad, because it needs to lighten up, because it hasn't earned any of its emotion, or anything like that. It's just too over the top, like it's full of itself. It's not very, like, it hasn't earned any of its grandeur, and so because of that, it doesn't feel like it's like the story is written very slice of life, down to earth, but the visuals are very, very like striking and operatic, and it's just a bad combination. It doesn't work ironically. It doesn't work like they're like in continuity with others. It's just a tonal mismatch between the writing and direction. So one of them is bad. I think the writing in general is bad, but the direction made it worse. Okay, anyway, that's gonna be it. This is the first Best Picture. I really don't like. All Autopsy probably on Saturday. Okay, so see ya. Cubs and Culture out.